The 2005 movie, V is for Vendetta, is set in a dystopian political future in which the government maintains a fascist control of the people through control of the media in a constant barrage of lies and propaganda. I trust that my love for this film doesn't really require much explanation. I imagine that most of us who feel like we are under siege these days can go back and watch that movie with some real relish. The plot revolves around a character who wears a Guy Fawkes mask, who is planning to complete the gunpowder plot of 1605 to succeed in blowing up the Parliament building for no reason other than to waken the people so that they will stand up against their government. The subtext of the narrative is that Fawkes can still inspire action even 400 years after he was executed. The main character of V knows that he is going to die in the process of carrying out his plot, but he is assured that his personal survival is irrelevant. The point is the idea of a revolution that needs to happen, the idea of freedom, of democracy, of justice. As such, these ideas cannot be killed. Ideas, he says, are bulletproof. Though entirely fictional, martyrdom in order to immortalize an idea has many historical precedents. I suspect that a lot of us can remember June of 1963 when the Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Quang Duc burned himself to death at a busy intersection in Saigon. His public martyrdom drew attention to the injustice of the Vietnam War and was, at least in part, a part of the turning of the public sentiment against the Vietnam War. Many years later, I was in my first year of seminary in the spring of 1980, having only been introduced to liberation theology when Archbishop Oscar Romero was assassinated, and we think assassinated by assassins who were trained in America at Fort Bennings, Georgia. One of his aides came and spoke to us at the Vanderbilt Chapel the next month, giving us an eyewitness account of this murder of a liberation theology icon. The progressive priests of Central and South America were systematically captured, tortured, many were murdered in the years that followed. All, I'm afraid to say, with the blessings, if not the assistance, of a conservative Vatican that chose to ally itself with brutal dictators in Central America out of their fear of socialism. The current pope, though he was a part of the machinery that silenced liberationists in Argentina, is now trying to assuage the Catholic Church's collective guilt by giving Romero the status of being canonized as a saint, which of course Romero would have never wanted and which entirely misses the point. But we're talking about the Catholic Church. As I have observed before, if all you have is a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. The Catholic Church is guilty of having cooperated with the arrest, torture, and murder of their own priests. And rather than confess their own sins, they want to elevate the first well-known martyr to the status of sainthood. Not at all unlike the way our country has treated the 1964 assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. We cannot canonize saints as a state, but we can make his birthday a federal holiday and then name all of the most dangerous, crime-riddled streets in major cities after him. Now even conservative politicians try to use King's name and quotes to polish their own reputations while trying to ignore virtually everything he said. But, men and women, ideas are bulletproof, and even from his grave, Martin Luther King continues to speak to us. Of course, I'm commenting on this because today is Easter in the Western world, following the traditional observance of the events of the Christian Holy Week, in which the world's most well-known martyr is now remembered. The oldest biblical accounts of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus were actually not recorded by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. They were recorded by the Apostle Paul, who was a zealous believer in the first century, who never met Jesus in the flesh, and who knew very little about his real historical biography. It's important to note in reading Paul as the first Christian to write about Easter, that even though he was a zealot, Paul never implies that there was an empty tomb or that anyone had seen Jesus in the flesh after the crucifixion. Paul talks about people having a vision. If you read the New Testament in the order in which it was written, which is a great way to read it, it's not hard to see how the mythic nature of the Easter story evolved over the decades. Paul wrote his letters 20 to 30 years before the first canonical gospel, Mark, was written. Paul describes Easter in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 this way: "For I handed on to you as of first importance that what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me, for I am the least of the apostles." Paul never met Jesus in the flesh. Paul wasn't chosen to be a part of the ministry of Jesus. But Paul was an early convert who preserves a tradition that the church shared with him. He didn't see it, but people told him. He did believe that 3 days after he was murdered, Jesus appeared to Peter, then to the 12 apostles, then to a gathering congregation of some 500 people, then to James, and then finally appearing to Paul. But you see, he says that the way that other people saw Jesus after the crucifixion was the same way that Paul saw Jesus after the crucifixion. Jesus appeared to Peter, the apostles, to a few hundred believers, to James, then to Paul. And each time he appeared in a vision. And a vision that Paul describes in 2 Corinthians, he says, "I knew a man who 12 years ago was taken up into third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, who heard things that cannot be repeated and saw things that cannot be described." It was a mystical visionary experience. It wasn't like Jesus of Nazareth with nail prints in his hands and feet coming and walking beside him on the beach. It was a vision, a mysterious vision that Paul even struggles to put into words. Paul would have believed that the body of Jesus was buried in an anonymous grave somewhere outside of Jerusalem, but the body of Jesus was of no interest to Paul. Paul believed that the Christ, who was a Spirit of God, was who was appearing to the faithful. The first canonical gospel, Mark, speaks of an empty tomb, but if you notice in the unedited versions of Mark, there are no resurrection appearances. There's just a mysterious empty tomb and a young angel who tells people at the tomb to go back to Galilee where Jesus had performed his miracle, basically telling them to go on doing what Jesus did. Mark describes Jesus as having been an ideal martyr whose death does not end his message. Mark seems to want his readers to have the same courage that Jesus had in the face of Roman occupation and threat, the courage to themselves become martyrs in opposition to Rome. Now, there is a gospel that was discovered early in the 20th century called the Gospel of Thomas. It's basically a saying source with very little narrative, but it's probably older than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but it doesn't mention a resurrection at all. At the end of the first century, the early church took hold of the story of Jesus, based the Holy Week events on the Gospel of Mark, and added physical appearances, and the message of Jesus by that was being transformed from a message of liberation theology, of courageous opposition to Roman persecution. They changed it into a message of Jesus rose from the dead and now you can too, a promise of eternal life, not to change this world, but for you to come to believe in a way so that when you died, you would go to a better world. This world, evidently, in that theology, is beyond redemption. The church, conspiring with political authorities of the day, tried to kill the idea of radical compassion in a revolution and replaced it with what Karl Marx accurately described as a religion that is the opiate of the peoples. It's what keeps people stupid and quiet and cooperative. I know that many of my peers in the traditional church think that I am somewhat uniquely radical in my representing of the Jesus narrative in this way, but I leave it to Thomas Jefferson, who in 1814 wrote a letter to Horatio Spafford and said it better than I ever could. Thomas Jefferson said, "The priest has been hostile to liberty. He is always in alliance with the despot, abating his abuses in return for protection to his own. It is easier to acquire wealth and power by this combination than by ever deserving them. And to effect this, they have perverted the purest religion ever preached to man into mystery and jargon unintelligible to all humankind, and therefore the safer engine for their purposes." What we in the progressive movement have been trying to say to the church in this era is not new. Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Voltaire, others tried to tell the people in their time, 200, 300 years ago, about the preposterous way in which Christianity has been turned into a ridiculous myth, and hence had all of its teeth pulled. Others have very magical beliefs about the promise of Easter, but I think the best interpretation comes from the 20th century Greek poet Dinos Christianopoulos, who wrote, "They tried to bury us, but they didn't know that we are seeds." A government killed Jesus, but it couldn't kill his teachings. Sadly, the church tried to bury his message in magic and superstition, and yet thousands of years later, some of us can still hear him calling us to a revolution. A government killed Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and generations of seminary professors have tried to make his message tediously boring, but his death reminds the church that it is our job to stand up to fascism in every conceivable way. Our government, working with a despot in El Salvador, murdered Archbishop Romero. Other assassins killed Gandhi, JFK, Bobby Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. But men and women, ideas are bulletproof. They tried to sweep all of them under a rug. Since they were killed, governments have tried to silence their voices, tried to scare us with threats of violence, unemployment, hunger, refusing medical care. They try to bury us. They just didn't know that we are also seeds. We are not the keepers of a dead religion, encased in magical thinking and silly, childish promises of some kind of literal heaven or frightening fires of hell. We are the one thing that governments and churches have to fear the most, because we have an idea, especially if we just refuse to be frightened, to be silenced, or even to play dead. because they know that all that stands between us and the end of fascism, the end of the abuses of religion and church, synagogue and mosque, what keeps us from real liberation is that we have not united with one another and awoken from the dream of propaganda to face the reality that challenges us. Whether our generation will wake up from its childish indifference or not remains to be seen, but this much I know, the world is ripe for a revolution, a reformation in economics, in government, and in religion. Whether it will happen in my lifetime or not, I cannot predict. I just know that it should happen now, and I would love to be a part of it, and I hope you would too.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.